So what we've got on the screen is a typical API architecture diagram for that's relevant in banking and other scenarios. As you can see, as you can see, there are two layers of APIs. This is very important because to do this properly, there's a couple of very critical considerations. One is the fact that you really cannot build any sort of API strategy on the back of individual siloed back office applications. So, as an example, your trade finance system may have APIs, your core banking system may have APIs, and that's great and that's fine. And if they have, you can consume them and you can factor them as part of your strategy, but you absolutely cannot build a full API banking strategy on top of a core banking API capability, right? So typically what you need is standalone, mature, full API management products at two layers. So you need an internal layer, which you can see at the bottom of my screen, of the screen here, and you need an external layer that you can see on top. The classification is typically the internal layers, as you can imagine, would be for the internal APIs, and internal APIs can be system APIs that are one-to-one mapped or published from underlying core applications, so such as core banking atomic APIs or APIs from trade finance system or from a payment system. Or you could have system APIs that are published there or created as composite APIs. So when I say composite APIs, it's a process of stitching together capabilities from multiple systems to create a composite API. And if you look at formats like typically BIAN APIs, they could come in at this level also, BIAN system APIs. And then at the lower level, you typically have a dedicated developer portal, you have a sandbox, you have a gateway, you need to have the right tools for metering, monitoring. Some companies are actually monetizing internal APIs also. So they establish charging mechanisms from one division to another. And that kind of is then used to be able to allocate cost apportionment correctly because APIs, are published from back office systems, and there are always costs allocated to maintaining these. But again, the internal API layer is specifically private. It's for a bank's developers who have been given the right access. And then you have a separate external layer. And as you can imagine, you typically will have more APIs at the external layer more APIs on the internal layer than at the external layer, at least to start. The external layer will have the same replicated capabilities, so typically gateway, sandbox, API discoverability, portal, and all that, along with the relevant tools for metering, monitoring, management of those APIs. But then there's a big difference in terms of who connects and consumes APIs at these internal and external layers. So typically, as you can see on the diagram, from the internal API layer is what will publish APIs to bank-owned systems and applications, and it could be, or let's say bank-owned channels to make it easy. Whereas the external API layer is typically where you put in things like open APIs, open banking APIs come in there, open finance APIs come in there. If you're going to be running embedded banking or embedded finance and publishing bank-owned products and services into third-party channels, those will typically be visible, available in the external API portal. We've got some examples on the screen here, which are typically WhatsApp and Instagram, but by no means is embedded finance limited to those very, very basic channels, but it can be anything. The point is APIs are key, and if you want to do it properly, or if you're setting up your API strategy properly, it's very important to have these two levels of gateways and API management systems in place with proper layering and segregation of these APIs.